Thank you so much, Dr. Vajaji. That was a wonderful journey of looking at things. Was unless there is some kind of a prayojana, there is no real knowledge that is there. And then that distinction that you made about the para-vidya, the kind of insightful things that it actually provides is it's profound, very profound. The way that I hope you must all have heard about it. The story of, and then they try to make that lion, and then there is this friend who says, don't do, he's saved ultimately. So what that story really tells us about is that fundamental and very, very important is that Viveka Jnana to distinguish whether it should be done or not. Not just about what to do and how to do, but also about why to do it or why not to do it. So I think invite Sri Pranav-ji, Vasishta-ji to talk about this from the Shastric perspective and Bharatiya Drashtikona.
Sri Gurubhyo Namaha, Sabhaya Namaha, Namostu Ramaya Salakshmanaya, Devyai Chatasya Janakatmajayai, Namostu Rudrendra Yamani Lepyo, Namostu Chandrarka Marutkanebhyaha. As somebody who is youngest on this panel, and also after, say, two stalwarts have spoken, the only kind of reason why I stand here is that I try to represent the parampara of my gurus. So whatever I be speaking is something that I've learned from them, and whatever is good in them belongs to them, and if there's any mistake, that's mine. So with these words, I'd like to start with the ideation of translation of knowledge to know-how, and there's a very specific question posed whether knowledge and know-how can be separated. I think, say, while it has already been asserted that Bharatiya Jnana did not actually separate knowledge and know-how, I'd also like to mention that even in the Greek thought, it wasn't the same. In fact, if one goes and looks at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, there's a distinction of knowledge drawn in there where you find three terms, many terms, but these three terms are very significant. One is episteme, the second is techne, and the third is phronesis. There's been a lot of literature that has come in the past 10 years, specifically speaking about how phronesis, which translates to practical wisdom in some sense, prudence in another sense, and these are all approximate translations, but they capture, say, practical wisdom and prudence captures phronesis. So how over a period of past few hundred years, episteme, which is primarily understood as scientific knowledge, and techne is art, how to translate, say, the nature of the sense of skills that are required to ensure that you can do something. These have been the focus of the world, whereas the sense of practical wisdom of phronesis went outside of the scope of what needs to be done. The sense of prudence is where the call for Viveka might as well come. So while I did want to say this as a beginning, I also want to point out that the sense of knowledge as a whole captures know-how. But whether knowledge as a whole is something that is learned is a key question in itself. So what captures the knowledge in all dimensions? This is a question that is posed, and we find responses from the tradition. We have Sri Harsha mention that every vidya has four sthanas: adhiti, bodha, acharana, and pracharana. Only in that place where all these four sthanas are prevalent can one say that the vidya is complete. Adhiti is learning for oneself. But how do you know that you have learned? It can only be done when, say, you are able to teach it to somebody else, bodha. But it's also important to know that you can only teach that which you have understood. So the way in which you can come to a conclusion as to you have understood something or not is when you have been able to impart what you have understood to somebody else. And if it has been inadequate and you notice that it is not what you intend to impart which has been imparted, then necessarily you realize that there is a gap. So how do you realize that, say, this gap can be filled? That's where, say, you try and with whatever knowledge that you have right now, with that bodha, you engage in the acharana of the same. Try to put it to practice. And almost all of Indian knowledge indeed mentions an anushtana of how to actually bring these to practice. So it is through anushtana that one realizes, and by anushtana I mean, say, if you have the knowledge of something that of language that you have learned, a few words, then you put it and frame a sentence. So what we do even in, say, when language is taught to a young child, this is what is done. So the way in which you bring that together and put it to use in your own life, in your own little way. So when you start doing it, that acharana increases the sense of understanding, the bodha, and that's a kind of a loop which is there. So every time, the next time you do a teaching, bodha, then because of the acharana, it actually enhances. And always the sequence remains the same, that the extent of bodha that you have is only that which you can impart as what you can teach. But more importantly, these three stages, though they are connected, the last one is the kind of hallmark that says you have indeed come to a stage where you can go around and tell people, what we call as preaching, the pracharana. So if you have a situation where you say something and the rest of the people just accept, just because of the kind of adhiti, bodha, acharana that you have carried, that's when the sense of the vidya is complete. Now here, say, the sense of knowledge and know-how, they are always intertwined because of bodha and acharana. So this is what I did want to bring in to attention. But there is also a key question. If you have knowledge and know-how, we want to get it to some purposive action. Some kind of a karma is to be done, which is why this is actually desired. So we have a very beautiful kind of description of what are the kind of characteristics required to ensure that whatever we try to act upon is indeed resulting in a success. So we have a word in our language called Karyasadhaka. A Karyasadhaka is somebody who is able to get the work done and done well. So amongst our itihasas, we have the figure of Hanuma, who is possibly the best Karyasadhaka that one can ever imagine. And in Sundarakanda, there's a very fine description of Karyasadhaka that one gets, and there are 4 qualities that are mentioned. I just thought I'd bring that to attention, specifically in the context of translating knowledge to know-how. Dhritir drishtir matir dakshim sakarmasu nasidati. This is the quote from Sundarakanda. And the 4 qualities mentioned are dhriti, drishti, mati, and dakshyam. Now, dhriti is certainly courage, and in our times we should also possibly say it is courage of conviction. It's not just courage to do something, but courage of conviction that this is the knowledge that I intend to put to action. And there are many reasons why our current world necessarily makes us run away from the knowledge that we have. And I was fortunate that I happened to learn from Swami Gyanswarup Sanand, who I believe was an embodiment of Adhiti, Bodha, Acharana and Pracharana. He was formerly Professor G.D. Agarwal of IIT Kanpur, who, because of his learning as an environmental engineer and also being the first member secretary of Central Pollution Control Board, and further also as someone who is a great devotee of Ma Ganga, he was ready to put his knowledge to action, so much so that he was ready to give up his life. He fasted unto death 6 times, and in 2018 he gave up his life seeking Aviral Ganga, and the manner in which he did that is a great lesson in itself. And having learned from him, I believe that this sense of dhriti, the courage of conviction, that what I have learned must indeed be put to action, even if it means that I am ready to give up my life. That is the sense of the dhriti. And the drishti is the sense of the focus to vision about, say, what is the purpose for which I am doing. That drishti, without which there is a very genuine possibility of getting astray. There are many kinds of ways in which one can get say, lost in the kind of activities that happen. And then you have mati. So the drishti, while it is actually clear about the goal, mati must be about the presence of the situation that one is in. Unless and until we are conscious of the nature of the situation that we are in, the drishti and the dhriti would not actually move forward. So having that presence of mind, and that too about the presence of and the awareness of the situation becomes important. And finally, the dakshyam. The dakshata is all that is the kind of requisite skills and the knowledge needed to ensure that the kind of karma that is taken up is never something that will fail. This is the learning from Hanuma as the Karyasadhaka. And it is important to also note that when does one actually get these sense of dhriti, drishti, mati and dakshyam? It is something that we learn from our tradition that any kind of a human action that is done, it comes only because of the kind of desire that we have. There is a sequence of how any action happens. Janati, ichchati, athakaroti. You need to have the knowledge. And this knowledge is again divided into some. And I thought I should bring this to attention because there is a classification of this done in Mimamsa. Nayayikas have done it. And that is something which requires great attention in every act that we do. So what is the first type of knowledge that you require? You of course need to know what needs to be done. So there is the Karyata Jnana that is called for. This Karyata Jnana is then that actually leads to a chikirsha. And chikirsha is a technical term used for desire, but it is a desire which has two other forms of knowledge included within it. One is that, say, if you have a desire to do something, that isn't by itself sufficient. You also need to know whether, say, you have the ability to get it to fruition. That ability and that knowledge is the kritisachata jnana. So kritisachata jnana by itself is not sufficient because your desire may not sustain for long. The knowledge itself, for it to say continue, there is the other form which is spoken of called ishta sadhanata jnana. That what you are actually trying to strive towards is also something that is your ishta, which is basically that which you desire strongly because it is that which you like to do. So it is when these things come together, that's when cheshta happens. And cheshta is the way where we bring in our motor organs to action, and that results in the karma. So with this kind of a tale, our key requirement in terms of looking at the knowledge to know-how comes when we start looking at the ideas when we need to develop a certain sense of desire also. Let's say in an earlier time, say there was no kind of a person because of the nature of culture that we had, I would not have acted on something which I did not understand. And if I understood something, I would not actually stop myself from acting upon it. This kind of a niyati is something that over time the society has missed. And that's something that we also find a lot of trouble, which is where we find the kind of requirement of talking about knowledge to know-how. If at all we say that any person who understands something, and because he understands it, he puts it to practice. And if I do not know something, if I do not understand something, I do not actually try and do it. This principle of niyati, if followed by every person, then we have a different world altogether. And that kind of a thing is a cultural entity that requires to be built. And this cultural thing cannot happen unless we also have certain values that are, and virtues in some sense, that our tradition did speak about. And we have a shloka that says, Ajaramaravat pragyo vidyam arthancha chintayet grihita evakeseshu mrityuna dharma macharet. That is, if you are actually trying to learn something or you are trying to, say, earn wealth, for these two, consider yourself to be immortal. But when it comes to acting on dharma, and what is this I don't have to necessarily mention, I'll come to it. But if it comes to dharma, act as if Lord Yama, the god of death, is holding your hairs by his hand. So this is a principle which holds for all times, and it is then that one would probably start thinking about how would I ensure that whatever I understood, I should bring it to practice. There are many things that you will find from our traditional community and also from our professors. What they say and what they do may have a gap. And the reason why that happens is something which is necessarily to be reflected on, if at all we need to move forward in life, and not just for ourselves, but for the entire world and also the coming future generations. This question, something that calls for a greater attention, I just thought I'd have to mention this. And in this context, I want to give a very traditional example of say, people who are the inheritors and people who are keeping up the knowledge that we all pride in, the Vedic knowledge. I was very fortunate to be associated with a family of scholars who are Nityagnihotrins, and they are people who also have performed Somayaga, and it is stated that our country is a Yagika Bhumi. So the performance of Somayaga is something that is desirable, because this is something that India can offer which no other country has. And why do you perform a yajna? We have very strong reasons to point out, and Gita Acharya has categorically said that the entire world is actually resting on the performance of the yajna. So the fact that this sense of yajna requires to be captured, and I was fortunate to witness a yajna called Trishahasragni Yukta Mahavrata Yaga. And while witnessing it, I learned some things which I thought I should necessarily bring to attention. The scholars who were performing this, and the Ritviks and the Yajamana, they made 2 points. See, when we speak of Veda, it is both Shabda and Artha Jnana. But the focus on Shabda Jnana, which is the recitation of Veda, has received a greater attention. But Shabda and Artha are a whole. We have the great Kalidasa begin Raghuvamsa by saying Vagarthavya Samprukto Vagartha Pratipattaye Jagadapitaro Mande Parvati Parameshwaro. The fact that Shabda and Artha are always together, and that sense is not captured in practice, not because there is no desire, but because the kind of society that we live in, it doesn't actually enable the kind of strengths to ensure that this happens. And how do we enable that can also bring in the practice of say, for example, the Yajamana that I spoke to was 70-year-old. And he told me, there is a Veda Vakya. I have learned Veda and several people have learned Veda. There is a Veda Vakya that says, Vasante Vasante Jyotishthomam Yadeta. What it means is that every Vasanta Kala, that is every spring, one must perform Somayaga. So he said, I can perform a yajna only after my marriage. So I got married when I was 20-year-old. Now I am 70. So over the past 50 years, have I conducted 50 Somayagas? The answer is no. So even in my own case, I have not been able to, though the Veda, by its very being, Veda is stated to be Anadi Apaurushaya, meaning that it is beginningless and authorless, because of which, if it says something, it must be done without any kind of a question. But that sense of, say, vidhi, the bhavana that this must be done, is something that did not actually translate in my own case, where I am aware of it. So why did this happen? It's a question that I do ask myself, but at least I'd like to do to the extent possible. So in that sense, I am actually seeking out people like you who are possibly, say, who could possibly go and tell to audiences in different places. And there are still people who are desirous of doing it, but because a yajna is not a task which is something that requires 1 or 2 people, but there is an entire society that actually enabled the yajna. So we have several jatis all put together were actually the required for the conduct of a yajna. In current market world, that itself actually splits. So you don't have the conducive atmosphere readily available. For it to be created requires a great kind of effort. And so even if there is a knowledge that say this must be done, the Artha Jnana, even if it is there, you do not have a parampara, then you do not know the know-how. So who would actually be able to perform a Srauta Yajna? A person who has already seen some yajnas being performed. This is what you do. This is how you actually say have the installation of a Yupastambha. So you need to know which place what and how it is done. Unless you are part of it and doing it, you will not be able to carry that forward. And this is not just true of Vaidika Yajna. It is true of Yajna of all kinds, because Yajna has been conveyed as a necessary requirement for all Varnas, which means all people in the world. This sense is something that means that unless and until we have the conscious knowledge of the parampara, the sense of know-how, which comes from knowledge that you can seek out and learn, would not be readily available to you. So how do we try and bring these together is one point that I thought I should bring to the attention. While this is the case, the whole world in the Indian tradition can be seen in terms of three realms, three planes: Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhyatma. It is normally you find that Adhibhuta get translated as the material physical world and Adhyatma as spiritual world, but these are, say, very gross translations and possibly wrong translations also. So there is a third, which is the Adhidaiva, which is a very important factor, which people like Sri Aurobindo, when they actually pointed out Bhavani Bharati, they were actually trying to point out how the sense of the people and all their energies put together form a Daivata. So there is the Adhidaivata Dharana, and that's something which is a very unique element of our country. There's nowhere in the world that you would find, say, land being treated as a mother also being treated as a Devata. You do not find, say, a river being treated as a mother also as a Devata. This sense of Adhidevata Dharana is very important for many reasons. One thing is that Adhibhuta is where Karya happens. Any action, because we have know-how and knowledge would mean that it has to translate to action, means that we want it to happen on the ground. And this happens in Adhibhuta, but the kind of force, the source of strength for it comes from Adhyatma. But for the Adhyatma, which is the cause for the effect that you find in reality, for it to translate, for cause to translate to effect, you need to have sufficient kind of forces and energies and powers that are supporting it. And where does that come? That comes from Adhidevata Dharana. I have a mobile phone here and I'm able to see it, and so are you. The fact that you are able to see it is because the I is the Adhyatma. This object and the kind of form it has is the Adhibhuta. Because there is light, and that light is somehow ultimately sourced to sun. So the Surya, Aditya, becomes the Adhideva. And this sense is where, say, the spiritual or material doesn't actually come to the fore. And there's a classification of this in Mahabharata that Bhishmacharya has given, and I thought it might help for this audience to learn. So I have a few printouts of the same that can be circulated. So while this is the case, I'd like to come to a kind of put these thoughts to a kind of conclusion by trying to point out that while we are desirous of action to be performed and the kind of various activities that one has to take up, there is this very important instruction given by Gitacharya where he mentions Adhishthanam tatha karta karanancha prithak vidham vividhascha prithak cheshta daivam chaivatra panchamam. So there are 5 different elements that go into ensuring that an act that one actually is desirous of accomplishing and bring it to fruition. And all these, when they actually are in alignment and supporting it, that's when the action does happen. So Adhisthana is the locus of action, and it could be one's own body, could be elsewhere. Karta is the agent who actually is acting on things. Karana are the various instruments that are there and the kinds of varieties of instruments that are involved. And one also has varieties of, once you have instruments, when you have the agent and also the locus where this action has to happen. Some activity has to happen. This is the cheshta. And these 4 do not capture the whole story. There's one invisible factor always present, which is the daiva. Once all these things are there, then does action happen. And our desire for having translation of our knowledge to action, where know-how is indeed a part of it, can come about only when we keep that these factors which are mentioned, and also the desire to be a Karyasadhaka oneself, like the exemplar of Hanuma, is something that we carry forward in all our efforts in whatever ways we can within the limited bodha that we have, and the process itself increases our bodha and we can indeed do better. So with these words, I'd like to achieve.
That was a wonderful explanation. exposition on from the Shastric perspective, Pranavji. That was wonderful, really great. You mentioned about Sundarakanda, Manva Ishtadeva, Hanuman, Drushtar Madhidaksham, Chokarmasa Nasidati. That, comes in when Surasa, that Akhyana there. And so, again, I want to circle back again to what we were thinking about. I think, again, you had mentioned all these, unless there is something that comes into acharana and backed by all these different aspects of self-learning, bodha, and then acharana, and then prachara, really we can't talk about a rejuvenation of knowledge systems. And I think you mentioned about the Vaidika Parampara, where you were mentioning about how this is so important. And I think even in the Laukika Parampara, if you look at the traditional way in which the Ayurveda practices is going on now, or if you look at any of the technologies, whether it be textile printing or any of these things that we have talking about, there are many that somehow that connection is somehow missing, and I think that is where the Bharatiya Drishti should be brought in. And also there is like kind of a I don't know, maybe I should say it's a misconception that when we talk about Indian knowledge systems, it's much more about spiritual things and not about Laukika aspects. Whereas we were highly practical people, and as Professor Dr. Bajaj mentioned, really looked at Prayojana and everything. And in fact, even the Kenopanishad says, Avidya Mrutyam Tirtha, Ishopanishad says, Avidya Mrutyam Tirtha, Avidyam Mrutamushtate. So, I mean, even the technology, all these things are to cross this ocean of the life.